I don't know about you, but I honestly think that the Pikmin series is legitimately one of the best video game franchises of all time in terms of having consistency in its quality, and I'd wager that most people who played a Pikmin game would agree with me, but as great as these games may be, it just never translates into sales, which is why there've only been 4 games total in the past 2 decades. And based on the fact that Pikmin 3 Deluxe wasn't even the best-selling game on the Nintendo Switch outside of Japan in its opening week during a year where there's almost nothing else on the console to compete with, things aren't looking too good for the franchise's future. However, despite the fact that these games never sell, I still believe that a Pikmin 4 would buck the trend and be a hit, not because it'd be that much better than the other games, but rather because it'd be the first game in the franchise that wasn't set up to fail. So sit back in your spiciest recliner, press the subscribe button if you like games, goofs, and glory, and allow me, Nashville's second worst bear handler, CameronAllOneWord, to tell you how Nintendo always sets Pikmin games up for failure, and how they can, not do that for Pikmin 4. Alright, so it might be a bit of a stretch to say that Pikmin games fail, since otherwise there wouldn't be 4 of them, but given how fun they really are, I truly believe that they should be more popular than they are, and while these games might not be for everybody, I can't think of a time where I've ever heard anybody say that they actively hate the Pikmin series. Well, aside from the people in the comments who are gonna be lying about it like 99% of the time anyway. I'm sure 1 or 2 of you might be serious, though. But for the most part, whenever people actually give these games a try, they either love it or at worst decide that it's not their cup of tea but still think it's pretty cool. So the issue at hand here is that if the quality's there, then just why aren't more people buying and playing Pikmin games as much as they do with Nintendo's other franchises? Well, with the first Pikmin game basically being a launch title for the GameCube, you definitely can't say that Nintendo picked a bad time to put that game out by any means. But the issue here is that it was on the GameCube, which is a console that everybody loves today, sure, but back in the early 2000s, the PS2 was tearing all kinds of booty, and most people who made room for the GameCube typically only did so for the franchises they knew about. And with the internet not being nearly as prominent or convenient at the time as it is today, most people who were used to Nintendo's more wacky adventures, including myself as much as I'm ashamed to admit it, just weren't ready to try a brand new Nintendo IP that looks like Pikmin. However, even though the first Pikmin game could and should have sold much better than it did though, the game did still end up selling pretty decently, and according to everywhere I've looked, it ended up selling better than any other title in the series to this day. So even though it was only the 25th best-selling GameCube game of all time, Nintendo still found that to be enough of a reason to warrant a sequel for the same console. But again, this is a game that really could have used the help of the modern internet, because the only people who really knew what the game was were the people who played the original, and I can't imagine too many people took a chance on such an unknown sequel beyond that. Especially when the hype and overall awareness of the GameCube died down pretty hard by 2004. So needless to say, the game didn't sell as well as the first one did. Then after that, the above-average sized den decided to re-release the first 2 games on the much more popular Wii with updates to accommodate the Wii Remote's pointer controls, and it was these 2 versions of the game that made me completely fall in love with the series myself. However, while I can't find exact numbers anywhere, the consensus seems to be that these games didn't sell very well, and I think that's because most people who owned a Wii back in the late 2000s typically didn't play games like Pikmin, and the people who would have normally been more open to it just looked at these games as nothing more than outdated and weird-looking GameCube titles without the help of the internet to better inform them. And yeah, I know the internet was a little more prominent at this point, which is actually how I decided to try these games for myself as a matter of fact, but the internet gaming communities still weren't nearly as strong as they are today, to where it's pretty hard for a Nintendo fan to not at least be aware of a high-profile first-party game. Next, of course, we got Pikmin 3, which is my personal favorite game in the entire series, and it actually sold pretty well considering how few people bought the console that it was on, but that's not really saying much because it was on the friggin' Wii U, which only the biggest diehard Nintendo fans literally even knew about, despite the internet being a pretty big factor by this point. And then, of course, there was the black sheep of the franchise, Pikmin. But not only did people perceive this to be obsolete for coming out on the 3DS after the Switch was already a thing, but for reasons I honestly can't even fathom, the hardcore Pikmin fanbase flat out rejected this game. I think the fear was that it was somehow delaying or even replacing Pikmin 4, that it would if the game were successful, but it wasn't even made by the same people, so I really don't think that it delayed Pikmin 4 even by a single day. I mean, don't get me wrong, Pikmin's definitely not as good in 2 dimensions as it is in 3, but if you put a gun up somebody's ass and told them that they absolutely had to take a dimension away from the Pikmin franchise, then this can only be considered a home run. So again, I don't see why people were babies about it. But regardless of why people were babies, this was yet another game in the franchise that just didn't sell very well, which I'd imagine only told Nintendo that people just don't want Pikmin. I mean, it'd be like begging your parents for pizza for weeks and then throwing a fit and not eating any just because they got Pizza Hut instead of Papa John's. Sure, some Pikmin and pizza are better than others, but at the end of the day, both are always great and definitely not something you should ever complain about. But with every Pikmin game up until this point, all I think pretty valid excuses as to why they didn't cut the mustard, there should have been no excuse for Pikmin 3 Deluxe to have a worse opening week than it did, right? I mean, after all, it is the definitive version of what many consider to be the best game in the entire series, not to mention that the Switch is spraying all kinds of ass with tens of millions of owners who've never played the original, meaning that the game would be new to them. Nintendo's online presence is stronger than ever. 2020's been a complete drought as far as original first-party games are concerned, concerned, and there's even a demo on the eShop so people could try it out for free, meaning that there's no risk whatsoever. Yet despite all this, the game sold even fewer copies in the UK during its opening week than it did on the Wii U, which is definitely concerning as far as the long-awaited Pikmin 4 is concerned. But regardless of all the advantages Pikmin 3 Deluxe may have had though, I still think that the game was set up for failure, cause yeah, most Switch owners might have been starving for new content, but at the same time, most people are just plain tired over the principle of buying Wii U ports at full price, regardless of whether or not they've ever even played these games in the past. And I don't know about the rest of the people who bought this game on the Wii U, but speaking for myself personally, I just have no desire to buy this game again. Man, I already 100%ed the original, and even though I loved every second of it, I just feel silly to waste any more time on a somewhat lengthy game that I've already played before, even if there is a little bit of extra content thrown in. I know there were a lot of other Wii U ports that sold pretty well throughout the Switch's life, but with there being so many of them to the point where I don't even feel like counting them all, I'd say that pretty much any Wii U ports from this point forward would have to be Mario or Zelda in order to sell in big numbers. But had Pikmin 3 come out a little bit earlier in the Switch's life though, I honestly think that people would have been a lot more open to the idea, although I suppose I really have no way of proving that. All I know is that taking the game off of the Wii U's eShop certainly didn't do the Switch version any favors, even though the $20 price tag probably wasn't helping too much either. But despite there not being very many other games on the Switch in 2020 though, there's also plenty of other shenanigans going on in the real world, like the PPR virus, as well as the election in the US, and even brand new consoles launching on top of all that. So even though most people would agree that Pikmin 3 is an absolutely fantastic game that everybody should play, it's still just not important enough to avoid being lost in the shuffle, as much as it pains me to say it. Anyway though, if you liked my take on why the Pikmin franchise was never able to catch a break, then you might like me roasting Nintendo in greater detail for taking Pikmin 3 off the Wii U's eShop, but for now, I'm gonna go take a shit. Poop. Later.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.